We now have a quorum, so we'll get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I am going to call today's Ordinance Committee meeting to order. This meeting is on 2 multifamily zoning petitions by the Cambridge City Council. This meeting will consist of a presentation from city staff, council questions, and discussion only. There will be no public comment. This meeting will be recessed and reconvene on Wednesday, December 4th, 2024 at 2:30 p.m. The meeting on December 4th, 2024 will be recessed and reconvene on Thursday, December 19th, 2024 at 5:30 p.m. There will be public comment at the meeting on December 24th, 2024 and on December 19th, 2024. Further, 2 additional meetings are being planned for January. The first order of business is a roll call of members present. Madam Clerk?
Councilor Azim. Absent. Vice Mayor McGovern.
Present.
Present. Councilor Nolan. Absent. Councilor Siddiqui.
Present.
Present. Councilor Sabrina Wheeler.
Present.
Present. Councilor Toner.
Present.
Present. Councilor Wilson. Absent. Councilor Zusi.
Present.
Present. Mayor Simmons. Absent. You have 5 members recorded as present and 4 recorded as absent.
Thank you. Pursuant to Chapter 2 of the Acts of 2023, adopted by Massachusetts General Court and approved by the Governor, the city is authorized to use remote participation at meetings of the Cambridge City Council and its committees. Please note that the City of Cambridge audio and video records this meeting and makes it available to the public for future viewing. In addition, third parties may also be audio and video recording this meeting. To watch the meeting, please tune into Channel 22 or visit the open meeting portal on the city's website. Members of the public are welcome to submit written communications to the city clerk's office at cityclerk@cambridgema.gov. With that, all of today's votes will be by roll call. Before I turn it over to the staff for the presentation, just very quickly, the timeline that we're looking at is, as mentioned, there is a meeting on December 4th and December 19th. We'll have public comment and further discussion. We are scheduling 2 meetings in January. I can tell you one meeting will be on January 16th. That's the last day because of various holidays that we can actually have a meeting and then vote on a recommendation or any changes that we would then send to the City Council for further discussion. In addition, again, because of holidays, the City Council will have to deal with and deliberate and make a decision by the February 10th meeting of the Council because it's a February 17th holiday. And this is all because of requirements to publish notifications in the Boston Globe, etc. So that's the run of the meetings. They will be posted soon, but there are going to be multiple other meetings. Vice Mayor McGovern and I, as co-chairs, really wanted to have this first meeting focused on the many questions that have been sent to us by residents and interested parties. I know that I sent over 50 questions, and I'm sure others sent more. So the staff is going to attempt to walk us through the responses as to the best of their ability to some of these questions. They also collected questions at their public forums and meetings they had in the past month. In addition, at the Economic Development Committee meeting, I think it was last week or a week and a half ago, the staff did provide responses to many of the more tangential issues around water supply, climate, tree cover, things like that aren't specifically about the zoning, but about other potential impacts of any upzoning possibilities. So if you haven't watched that, you can definitely watch that to get a lot of answers to your questions. With that, I'm going to turn it over to the Vice Mayor. I don't know if you have anything to say as co-chair.
Excuse me. Not much. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I do want to really thank the city staff. This is quite a thorough report, and I know it took a lot of work, and you're trying to work quickly as the timeline is ticking, and there's a lot of interest in what we're doing. So I appreciate that very much. And again, as Councilor Toner said, we are trying to, whether it's the public meetings that are happening in the community, or whether there are these meetings, we are trying to give this as much air and light as we can. So I appreciate everyone's cooperation.
Thank you. And I'll turn it over to Assistant City Manager Farouk to introduce her panel and guide us through the remaining hour and a half or so. Thank you.
Thank you to the co-chairs and to the rest of the Ordinance Committee. We have, since this petition was referred by the Council to the Planning Board and the Ordinance Committee, we have been working, let's say, double time to try to get some of the analysis that the Council has requested done, as well as work on responding to the questions that have come up. Thank you, Chair, for mentioning the Economic Development Committee meeting, committee hearing, where we spoke to some of the impacts that folks have asked questions about, things like economic impacts, impacts on infrastructure, and so on. So I agree that if folks are curious about those, that is a really good meeting to watch, because we actually did pull together relevant city staff from multiple departments to address those issues. In terms of our agenda today, we are focusing on, since this is a hearing about the petition, we will be walking through the zoning components of the petition, and we will also walk through responses to the response to the policy order that the Council had filed, asking for an analysis of what build-out, development and build-out might look like under multiple other scenarios that Council was curious about. You will note that we also, in addition, have added a couple of scenarios to that, just because some of it is responsive to what we heard during the community engagement that we did. So the two community meetings that Councillor Toner mentioned, as well as we've met with some neighbors and met with the East Cambridge planning team. So we're happy to continue that engagement, and we also have been really trying to answer questions that have come up through that. We are putting together a frequently asked questions document so that it becomes something that people don't have to just watch video, and will be able to have a written resource. Our hope is to have that ready by the end of next week, so that folks have a chance to review that ahead of the next Ordinance Committee hearing. So before we dive into the presentation, I just want to introduce the team here. From CDD, we have Melissa Peters, Jeff Roberts, Evan Spitrini, and Lev McCarthy, one of our neighborhood planners who's been working on this, is on the Zoom. From the Housing Department, we have Chris Cotter, and I believe Cassie Arnaud is also on the Zoom. We have the city solicitor here. We also have Bree Henselt and Matt Kinda from Agency Landscape and Design, who have been working with us on both on the analysis as well as on the outreach here. So they are here both to watch, and if there are really, really tough questions.
Before you go any further, I just want to recognize that Council Nolan is present.
So with that, Chair, I am going to turn the microphone over to Jeff Roberts to walk us through the zoning petition components.
Thank you. Jeff Roberts, Director of Zoning and Development. I'm just going to take a moment to share the presentation that we have. Okay, I don't have to ask if everyone can see it, because I can see it. First of all, I apologize for my voice, but we're trying to keep this as brief as we can, and that will probably be in service of that goal. So, okay. So we're going to start just with a little bit of a context, just a few snapshots of things that I think help cover some of what led to this particular proposal. So this is a statement from the 2019 Greater Boston Housing Report Card that puts a lot of the regional issue of housing in context. I think one of the main takeaways from this, to just again to contextualize, is that the issues that we see with housing availability and affordability, both at a local level and a regional level, are issues that have taken decades to create. They're probably going to require decades to resolve, and will require a variety of different approaches, of which zoning is only a part, but it is an important part. Our 2019 comprehensive plan anticipated, as part of meeting the city's housing goals, a 25% increase in housing units by 2030. And Melissa's going to talk a little bit more about this later and the work that we've been doing around it. But the overall takeaway is that this particular proposal, along with other planning and zoning efforts underway in places like Central Square and Mass Ave, will contribute to meeting these housing targets, but none will necessarily get us all the way there on their own. So shifting to look at multifamily housing, which is the subject of this petition, the role that multifamily housing plays in Cambridge's housing stock is very important. Walking down the streets of Cambridge, you would see that the majority of residential buildings in the city are single family or two family, but the vast majority of people housed in Cambridge are housed in multifamily housing, and many of those are in the kind of the older three-decker stock that we see around the neighborhoods, but also in larger buildings. Multifamily housing is found throughout the city, though in some cases not distributed evenly throughout all different neighborhoods of the city. And a big part of that difference is because our zoning prohibits multifamily housing in many parts of the city just as a matter of use. It also has requirements that in some cases make it practically very difficult to create multifamily housing. This illustration of where multifamily housing is not allowed within the city shows a bit of what we mean when we talk about exclusionary zoning. And this is an idea that it's gotten a lot of attention broadly around the country. The idea that when cities prevent multifamily housing from being created through zoning, it can have the effect of making those areas less accessible to households that don't have the economic means to access single-family homes or other larger kinds of homes. So multifamily housing reform is not a new issue. It's been relevant in many communities around the country. States as different as Oregon and Montana have adopted statewide legislation around trying to reform zoning around multifamily housing. Massachusetts, through the MBTA Communities Law, has taken a shot at that as well. The City Council here in Cambridge has been focused on this issue since 2021, and there have been several discussions and proposals in the past several years leading to the Housing Committee's proposal that we're discussing today. These were the main issues highlighted by the City Council earlier this year. Since the City Council wrote this policy order, I don't need to talk about it too much, but this was the direction that the Housing and the committee staff took to work on as we developed a proposal around this issue. And then the Housing Committee discussions focused on potential zoning approaches at a conceptual level. Also heard from many people about issues that can make multifamily housing difficult to create, both due to zoning and to other factors. That ultimately led to a recommendation to the City Council, which then became a zoning petition in September. So at the end of the Housing Committee process, the committee decided to move forward on this concept, which includes allowing all housing types citywide, stripping away some of the requirements in zoning that can limit the density of housing development in various ways, like with minimum lot sizes and lot area per dwelling unit. Proposing 6 stories above grade is the lowest residential height limit, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go. There's a lot to the specifics of the zoning, which is going to be what I'll walk through in the next part of it. Again, trying to answer a lot of the specific questions that have come up. But it's important to remember that everything in this proposal comes back to these kind of core concepts that were laid out at the Housing Committee. So here are the changes. There are basically 7 categories of zoning changes that are incorporated into this. I'm going to go through these one at a time, trying to just hit on the main points of what's proposed to change, and happy to go back and answer questions and get into any more detail that the committee members would like. One technical point, which I know most people have caught on to, is that this zoning petition is not actually just one zoning petition, it's 2 zoning petitions, and this is being done for a very technical reason, which is because state zoning law, as it was amended in 2021, says that certain zoning changes require a simple majority vote by the city council, while others require a 2/3 majority vote. But it needs to be clear, which is which, which changes fall into which category. So with help from the law department, with looking at the proposal as a whole, which is mainly how we're looking at it, we worked on separating those changes into the 2 categories that state law lays out for which requires which quantum of vote. Before we talk about what's changing, I just wanted to highlight some of the requirements that aren't changing with this proposal, because honestly, these are some of the things that we've received the most questions about. Sometimes the information that's going around doesn't always make it clear, especially when we focus just on the changes. Inclusionary housing requirements are not proposed to change. So, with all these changes, it's still the case that developments of 10 units or 10,000 square feet require the 20% affordable component. Our climate resilient zoning, which was adopted just last year, which require protection against long-term flooding impacts, has the green factor requirement, which sort of overlays onto the open space requirements, requirements for trees and plantings and other site design features. I'll talk about that a little more later. 25,000 square feet or more development subject to green building requirements. They have to meet the LEED or passive house or enterprise green community standards. Also, the green roof requirements, which were adopted a few years ago, continue to apply. And then several things that are outside of zoning are not affected by this proposal. So historic regulations, the demolition delay ordinance, conservation district commission review, all of those are still in effect. They continue to sort of be untouched by change to the zoning. And then other requirements in state law, the building code requirements, fire safety, sanitary code, which talks about, overcrowding of units and prevents overcrowding of units. The fossil fuel free pilot, these are all just examples. The tree protection ordinance, we've gotten many questions about all of these things, and the simple answer to all of them is that those are not being changed by this proposal.
Mr. Roberts, I'm going to stop for 1 second to recognize Councilor Wilson. Councilor Wilson?
Present.
Present.
Thank you, sorry.
Thank you. So then that takes us to the changes themselves. So the first few changes are fairly straightforward, and the first set is to the zoning map itself, kind of going directly at that issue highlighted at the beginning of exclusionary zoning. The most straightforward way to describe the proposal is that it consolidates all of the residential neighborhoods in the city into one resident C1 designation. It says resident C1 is currently the most widespread zoning designation in this zoning map, and it becomes more so. This deletes the residence A and B districts, whose purpose is explicitly not to allow multifamily housing. So that's what this change does. So the current zoning map here highlights those districts that were talked about at the beginning in sort of the light yellow, the residence A and B districts, and then the proposed zoning map looks like this, where the residential neighborhoods in the city are all to one uniform district. And here's the same thing, so you can see side by side the difference in which districts are being rezoned, and then how it looks at the end. This is the change that effectively makes multifamily housing an allowed use citywide. We'll talk about how there are some other changes that are sort of necessary to make it practically possible citywide. And it ensures consistency across the city, where one neighborhood is not treated differently from other residential neighborhoods in different parts of the city. So the second set of changes, a little bit more complicated, but still kind of a straightforward an approach as we can come up with, which is to take certain requirements in our zoning that are most closely associated with housing unit density, things that basically limit the number of housing units that you can build on a lot, and removing them for residential use. Keeping in mind that for non-residential uses, the current floor area ratio limitations would continue to apply. This is a graphic. We've shown this in some previous presentations to the council and others to kind of illustrate how these requirements as currently applied in our zoning ordinance can have an exclusionary impact. This is true, both in Cambridge, but also more broadly as people look at zoning in different cities and towns. That when you have these minimum lot sizes and density requirements, often what results is while it's not a requirement, it pushes development towards larger and fewer units on a lot. So again, those units being less accessible to a broader range of households that may be looking for housing in Cambridge. Another issue with these particular standards is that most of the housing in Cambridge neighborhoods that were built before zoning was first enacted in 1924 largely don't conform to these standards. And in fact, these don't date all the way back to the 1924 zoning ordinance. These are standards that were adopted later. Whether or not it was intended, these changes to the zoning ordinance over time are a main reason why most lots today can't be rebuilt to what currently exists in those neighborhoods, and in most cases can't add new housing units, and as we've seen in some cases, might even result in fewer housing units being built than what currently exists. So the overall effect of this change is to allow more housing units, to remove exclusionary standards so that smaller units can be created, a greater range of sizes, and making existing housing more conforming to zoning. We have talked a bit with the council before about how this change impacts our institutional use regulations. This is something we believe we'll need to revisit in the future if this is a petition that's adopted. But an important point is that while this change may change how we regulate the uses, those institutional uses that are non-residential will still be subject to the current height and FAR limitations under the proposed zoning. So they wouldn't be subject to any increases in height and density. They would still be subject to the current requirements. Yep.
Councilor Nolan?
Quick clarifying question. For the institutional use regulations, is that local ordinance or state law?
It's both. So state law provides rules about how cities and towns can regulate certain types of uses, including religious uses and public or nonprofit educational uses. Cambridge has a special home rule legislation which dates back to the 80s, which says that Cambridge can regulate those uses in specific ways in specific districts. And this change to the zoning would, because those current rules, as shown on the screen, only apply in districts that require a minimum lot area per dwelling unit, then by changing those standards and doing away with those standards, we would no longer have the ability to use that home rule legislation.
Thank you.
I'll move on. The next part is about height. This is the part we've heard probably the most about, not surprisingly. This proposal, because it moves away from density standards and focuses instead on stories above grade, is the main development control. It changes some of how we regulate height. Our current height limits are based just in feet. It doesn't regulate how many stories can be built up to that height. So this is a sort of a different way to regulate density from the current sort of FAR and unit system that we have. There would still be a height limit in feet under the proposal, but the height limit in feet is intended to be more flexible to account for sort of minor variations in height, which might depend on site-specific factors or construction type and construction techniques for buildings. And again, these, and we'll talk a little bit more about the proposed heights, but these standards would just apply to residential and not to non-residential uses, which would still be subject to the current requirements.
Can I just ask on the height, would that 75 feet include the mechanicals on the roof that they need, or is it 75 feet plus whatever they might need on top of that?
No, mechanical equipment, particularly for a residential building, it tends to be sort of what we call appurtenances, which are sitting above the roof. So they would not be under our current zoning. They're not considered within the height limit. They're considered sort of things that sit above the roof.
So if you had a building 75 feet tall and then you had mechanicals and somebody put something around it to make it look nicer, you're potentially looking at something that might be 80, 85 feet, visually anyway.
It could have that impact. There are some standards that we have for larger buildings for 25,000 square feet or more that require screening and require that mechanical equipment be shielded. But yeah, those things that, parapets or, chimneys, in HVAC equipment, those kind of appurtenances that sit on top of a roof are not part of the height limit.
Thank you.
Yep. This would, going back to explaining the proposal, so this would propose to make the height limit for housing 6 stories above grade in the districts that currently allow less than 75 feet, which is everything from Residence A and several other districts up to Residence C2A. And this would allow what we refer to as mid-rise housing development in all zoning districts. And just a point about the 75 feet, in modern construction under the sort of current building codes, most 6-story buildings tend to be about 70 feet or are sometimes a little less than that, because building codes get more stringent when buildings exceed 70 feet above grade. The idea with a 75-foot height limit, and this is consistent in other districts too, where we've changed height limits from height limits in feet to height limits in stories above grade. The principle is to set the height limit in feet a little bit above average so that there's some flexibility if buildings are, a foot or so or a few feet above like what's normal or what's average, because we do tend to find that, while the average might be a certain height, there's often some variation of 5 feet or so in the actual height above grade for different kinds of buildings with the same number of stories. So this is everything shown in map form. So under current zoning, these are the height limits that apply. The yellow, the lightest shade of yellow is 35 feet, going all the way in base zoning up to 120 feet. And then some taller heights that are allowed in some special areas of the city. And then the proposed zoning, takes all of the districts that are at or below the 75-foot height limit under current zoning and assigns a 6 stories above grade limit. And then the other districts where the heights that are allowed are taller, again, the existing height limits are sort of translated into the best match for how many stories above grade that would be. So going all the way up to 10 stories in some of those districts that are 120 feet, and then other districts may be taller based on special district requirements. Again, this is just looking at a comparison on one screen. So just as a quick note about mixed-use buildings, this is actually one of the things one of the ways with the zoning has a lot of benefit compared to the current zoning. Non-residential uses are still limited by height and FAR, which are typically less than the residential limits under current zoning. So if you were designing a mixed-use building, like a residential building with ground story retail, under the proposed zoning, it's easier to tell if that's allowed, because all you need to see is does a non-residential portion meet the FAR and height requirements for non-residential uses, and then is the total number of stories above grade within the residential height limit for stories above grade. It's sort of a logical way to do it. It's not the way the current zoning works. I won't get too much into the current zoning, but this current zoning makes it much more complicated to design and build a building like this, and often will result in needing to get variances or other kinds of relief. So the overall effect of the height section is to make development standards for housing a little more straightforward and easier to apply for residential use, and in particular to allow buildings that are taller than that current zoning allows, and taller than in many neighborhoods than is typical. I'm sure we'll talk more about the sort of different pros and cons. One of the reasons why the Housing Committee was interested in this approach is that by allowing a larger development, it would enable more development that would be subject to inclusionary housing. Again, there's a threshold for inclusionary housing requirements, and generally speaking, inclusionary housing tends to work better when there's more units to support it. That was one of the things that we talked about at the Housing Committee. And we'll also talk a little bit later about what these changes do with the affordable housing overlay, which change a bit based on the proposal. The proposed changes to the setback and open space requirements are a little more nuanced. There's a few key themes to follow. One theme is to try to simplify requirements that we currently have that are more convoluted and often have the effect of making any kind of reasonable site design impossible without needing to get variances or other kinds of zoning relief. Another theme is to try to reduce the setback requirements. Those requirements can be more constraining on some lots, but on the flip side, to retain open space requirements, which serve the city's planning objectives, but can be applied in a way that's a little more flexible than setback requirements to account for different kinds of site designs and configurations. A final theme is to try to move towards greater consistency, both across districts in having sort of more uniform setback and open space requirements, but also for different types of uses. Current zoning often has more lenient setback and open space standards for residential than for non-residential use, and we want to try to move away from scenarios where it might be preferable to do non-residential simply because the zoning requirements are less strict. Current setback requirements, very hard to explain, but the main takeaway is that almost no buildings that predate zoning conform to our current setback requirements, and it's also very difficult to alter or to build a new residential building without needing to get some kind of setback relief. Under the proposal, there's an emphasis on front yards, and requiring front yards, as noted in the first slide, that are similar to what currently is required in Residence C1 with a 10-foot residential setback, and less than that only in districts that currently require less than a 10-foot setback. Front yards are where there's potentially the greatest public benefit, both in terms of design and environmental enhancement, and that's also where there's the kind of transition between the public realm and the private. Side and rear yards are a little trickier. They tend to be a little bit less consistent across the city when you look at existing conditions. We looked a few years ago at side and rear setbacks in the context of allowing exterior insulation on buildings, and we found that a vast majority of older buildings have at least one setback that's less than even 5 feet from the property line. In many cases, even less than that. The proposed zoning would not set minimum side and rear yard setbacks. And what that means is that requirements like the building code and fire safety requirements, as well as open space requirements, which we'll talk about in a second, become more of the limiting factors in site design than the side and rear yard setbacks.
Can you tell me what those are? Only because one of the fears many people have expressed is building right up to the property line, 2 feet between two buildings. I mean, what does the building code and fire regulations say about how close one building can be to another?
The way that building codes and fire safety codes work is a little different than the way that zoning works. It's not a prescriptive setback. It's a little bit more of what you might call performance based, where what you have to build into your building depends on how far it is away from other buildings. So if you're, say like 10 feet away, you have, fewer requirements in terms of like fire rating, and, you could have windows in your wall, which is for a residential building is very important, because for residential buildings, you need to have, windows into bedrooms and everything. But if you make the setback smaller and you're, closer to other buildings, then the requirement for fire ratings go up. You can't have as many windows in the wall, and as you get progressively closer, you get more and more constrained in terms of what you can actually build. So if it does allow, fire code would allow for for example, buildings that are side by side, like a row house design, if they're fire rated, party walls, and they don't have windows in between them. But as you get into other kinds of scenarios, it tends to push, designers and developers of residential buildings towards providing some setback in order to, to not have to meet the more stringent requirements, especially if they're designing a building that needs to have, residential windows on it. So it's not as simple as saying, the fire code requires that you have this exact setback. It's more, it's more nuanced than that. And then, from other, fire safety standpoint, there's also egress. So you need to have, you need to have for multifamily buildings, usually 2, routes of egress for residents of the building for fire safety. And that means you need to be able to get out of the building and away from the building. That's something that the fire department looks at all the building permit applications to review and make sure that it's meeting the requirements of the code, and to make sure that it's providing the egress that's necessary. Again, what that actually results in may be different depending on the conditions of a particular lot, and where the building is situated on the lot, what's happening around that building. So it's again different from zoning, because we can't point to a prescriptive standard that says it has to be this many feet or it has to be this exact location. But it would be more of a site-specific review.
Thank you. Vice Member Governor?
Jeff, could you just bring the mic a little closer to you, if possible?
I'm sorry, are people having trouble hearing me?
There we go.
Have to start all over again.
I can start over. Okay, is this better? Okay. Are there more questions?
Council Zusi, sorry.
Yeah, so if there are 2 lots and the first lot is redeveloped, that developer could basically build to the lot line, right? But then if the lot beside it wants to develop, then they would need to, the fire department would require them to actually have a setback. Is that what you're suggesting? So there would be a real advantage to be the first on your block to develop.
I can't say for sure if that's something that's likely to happen. I think the code again doesn't regulate the setbacks in exactly that same way. So that could be. All I can say is that it's a fairly typical pattern in Cambridge now. When buildings were built, sometimes with building codes in place at the time, before zoning, when there were building codes in place and people were building buildings, that was a pattern that was common. And you walk down, you can't usually see where the property lines are, but if you walk down the street and look at a map, you see a pattern where buildings were, up to a property line, then the next building was set back and then built out to its property line, and then another building was built and set back to its property line. So, So that could potentially be an outcome, but I don't. We probably need to talk to, some designers, so people have some expertise in working in that kind of situation, understand if that's something that's likely to happen or not.
Thank you. Council Nolan?
Sorry, just to follow up. So there is no specific, what we've heard is that there's a requirement to either have windows or not have windows. There's no specific amount of space that a fire department would require if you have windows on the side of a building?
That's the answer to that question is that I understand that the fire department looks at every building design, every building permit proposal, on a case by case basis. So there may not be a specific requirement that's laid out as clearly as the zoning lays out a setback requirement, but the fire department might make an assessment of a design and raise concerns about if it doesn't seem like there's enough, if they feel like there might not be enough space for people to make if you have a window with an egress out of the window, for example, which is the requirement of the building code for bedrooms. The fire department might look at that and have concerns about whether people, if they were actually getting out from that egress, would be able to really get away from the building. That's
Okay. I just
City
find
Manager?
it, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Council Nolan?
Yeah, I've just heard different reports about how much discretion the fire department. I thought there were state law. I just would like us to be clear, because as much as I like our fire department, I wouldn't want discretion to lead to either confusion or inability to build when we would want them to build.
Assistant City Manager?
Through you, Chair. So the law, sorry, not law department, the fire department does, per the code, there are certain restrictions, and then there's a certain amount of latitude that the fire department does have today and would continue to have that. That latitude would not change in this. The zoning would in no way change how much authority and discretion that the fire department has. The code gives them some degree of latitude, and that would continue. I do think that the tighter, as Jeff is saying, the tighter the proximity gets, the more, I think this is essentially the take-home, is that the more restrictive the rules are about what somebody can do or not do on the face that are proximate to their neighbors. And if a more detailed, I'm not sure that the fire department could provide a much more detailed explanation than this, just because each scenario, each situation is different, and they are actually having to make a judgment call. But we could certainly see if there is some more light that they could shed on this question.
Council Sabrina Wheeler?
Thanks. Not to put too fine a point on it, but just wanted to underline the point that the CDD had raised, that there are so many buildings that have already been built that have less than this side yard setback. I live in a triple decker. I can reach out and touch the building next to me, and if I open up that window, right, my building does not meet these side setbacks. This is a building that was built a long time ago, does not meet these side setbacks. The building next to mine can reach out and touch the building next to it, does not meet the side setbacks. If we go a quarter mile that way over to East Cambridge, there's row houses, right? Row houses have 0 setback. If we're really concerned about the fire standards, 10% of the buildings in Cambridge probably right now do not meet these setbacks. If we think it's a fire risk, do we want all those people to move out? I'm a little confused about, we're very concerned about future fire hazards for new buildings, but probably 10% of our buildings do not meet this right now. So just wanted to underline this point, that is, this is not a new thing we're talking about. This is a huge number of buildings that currently do not meet these setback standards.
I'm not going to get into debate. I think that's something we just need to be. Oh, I'm sorry. I think part of the reason those zoning codes were put in was because of a concern going forward, because those buildings wouldn't be allowed to be built right now. And what we're being asked to do is to consider whether we want to remove those setbacks. So, it'd be helpful to get some further clarification from the fire chief or whoever in his department about what the safety issues may or may not be.
Absolutely. We're happy to look into that more, but I think the overall, again, one of the overall takeaways here is that there are a lot of constraints and, design kind of challenges that come along with residential construction. Some of that is zoning and some of that's not in zoning. So there's sort of a balance between using zoning to set these sort of very broad standards about, dimensional standards about where the building envelope is and where it can be built and where it can't be built, and then, how that either can work along with or sometimes work against other code requirements that impose other kinds of constraints. And, all at the end, once you put everything together, you have to make sure you meet all the requirements, and there's a balance between how much kind of requirement to put in place, and then how much you enable housing to get built.
Thank you, and I'm sorry for
Sure.
getting you off track. So
No, I think this is an important. We have gotten a lot of questions about this, and I think it's an important thing to talk about. The open space, just kind of moving on, is the piece that changes the least of all of this, because the proposal does maintain the minimum ratios of open space to lot area existing in current zoning. Of course, keeping in mind that going back to the beginning, it rezones most neighborhoods to residence C1, where the open space requirement is 30%, whereas in the residence A or B districts, the requirement is 50% or 40%. The standard that exists in residence C1 that's retained is that half of that required open space is supposed to be permeable and half is private. The way it's worded in current zoning, it's a little confusing. It actually says that the requirement is private open space, but only half of it has to be private open space. So one of the changes that we're proposing, which is kind of an overall kind of clarifying change, is to say that the requirement is a total open space requirement, which includes all of the types of open space, permeable open space and private open space. And there are some changes proposed where private open space, which currently can include at-grade open space as well as open space above grade on balconies and decks, but with kind of a somewhat confusing set of standards that apply to the above grade spaces, is just to set a more straightforward set of standards which say that how large and what dimensions an above grade open space has to have in order to be counted as private open space. In addition to all of this, there's the green factor that I mentioned earlier. So you have to meet a performance-based score in order, which is done with different kinds of site design features. Preservation of trees and planting of new shade trees are the most heavily weighted pieces of the green factor score. We've been applying this to development of all scales for the past year or so now, and we've seen that it's resulted in a more thoughtful approach to landscape design to incorporate those kinds of features. And as a reminder, because we could get this as a question every time, surface parking and driveways are not part of open space. Open space is just open space that's usable by pedestrians, bicycles, or just green space that's planted or permeable. So at a high level, the effect of these changes is to shift the sort of limiting factor in site design more toward open space, making other site design constraints more flexible. Or into the last few sections. So the proposed changes to special permits and project review at a high level are meant to move from a system where housing development sometimes needs a special permit, often needs a special permit, even at very small scales of construction, sometimes doesn't require a special permit, depending on where it is and the context, and moving to a more consistent citywide system of escalating review requirements. So as the development gets bigger, more stringent requirements apply. So these are all thresholds for review of development that conforms to zoning requirements. So this is a whole different process from development that would need a variance that would not conform to the zoning requirements. when we talk about project review, the focus is mostly on urban design and mitigation of impacts. We do a lot of that now through a special permit process, which works fairly well because it allows for binding review and the ability to include an impact mitigation program in the conditions. This is especially important for development of larger scale buildings, but at smaller scales, the special permit can impose a significant burden of time and cost. And a big issue with that is the risk of a special permit being appealed, which can put housing development into litigation for months or years and make it effectively just very, very prohibitive. So that's why in our current zoning, for development at smaller scales, we try to use other tools like prescriptive standards, design-based standards that apply, that can be reviewed administratively, and sometimes advisory review processes where you can get some advisory input and public input from the public and from staff, but not something that requires a discretionary approval. So the new thing, which is maybe not so new, that gets introduced in this proposal is the planning board advisory consultation. That's modeled after the process that's been used for the affordable housing overlay so far. It's essentially like a special permit process, but is not based on a discretionary approval, so it doesn't have the risk of appeal. It does require community outreach. It requires two meetings to review plans, both at a conceptual level and then later at a more detailed design level. And this chart shows, looking both at at housing in general as well as the affordable housing overlay, which is kind of what this advisory review is based on. This shows the differences in review procedures, which it tends to be more variable for all housing compared to the affordable housing overlay, which is all just one process for development. And then the proposed changes aim to create a more balanced approach on both sides, where for smaller development you have less of a burden increasing, where under general zoning, 75,000 square feet or more will still require a planning board special permit. So those really larger scale housing developments, but there's less of a special permit and more other tools being used at smaller scales. So I already just talked about this. Just a few other changes I won't talk about too much, but the idea that if you're looking at through the petition with an eagle eye, you find a few places that you might have some questions about. The proposal, because the changes that are proposed, the main changes that are proposed are fairly broad and affect the kind of central pieces of the zoning ordinance. There are a lot of other things that need to be changed for consistency. So some of that has to do with alterations to non-conforming buildings and how those apply, which will be a little bit different compared to current zoning based on all the underlying base changes that are proposed. And then another set of changes deals with situations where a lot is in two different zoning districts. It's fairly common in our zoning, but that's another area that needs some tweaks based on the overall themes. And I added just a detail about accessory apartments because a few questions have come up about that. Again, the main set of zoning changes makes it somewhat irrelevant. You no longer would be, if you wanted to do an accessory apartment, there wouldn't be anything in the zoning that really prohibits you from doing it. So the proposed zoning kind of strips away the whole complicated sort of BZA process that currently exists to kind of get around some of the existing zoning rules, and simply says that these are allowed, and there's really nothing else that needs to be said. The last piece is just the affordable.
Mr. Roberts, Council Wilson.
Thank you. I just have through you, Chair, I just have a clarifying question on accessory apartments, if you can just define that a little bit. So
an accessory apartment, something that's gotten a little bit of attention lately in kind of broader zoning conversations. It's defined as and some people call them accessory dwelling units or ADUs. It's the idea that within a single family home, you can build in what's called a subordinate dwelling unit within the building, which has all the features of a dwelling unit, like bedrooms, bathroom, kitchen, but is otherwise kind of subordinate to that larger single-family home. So in much of the state, and in fact much of the country, which is zoned only to allow single-family homes, someone, a homeowner or a resident might be prohibited from, adding a unit like that. Sometimes they're called sort of in-law apartments or granny flats because they might be for a family member, but they could also just be, rental apartments. So it's gotten a lot of attention because of this issue that so much of the country is zoned only for single-family housing. In Cambridge, it's a much smaller part of the city that's zoned for multifamily housing, and the way our current zoning works is if only single-family housing is allowed, you can get a special permit for accessory apartments. This zoning change is proposed because it makes multifamily allowed citywide. It no longer really matters, whether accessory, apartments are explicitly allowed or not. You could just add a unit if you want to add a unit. But the state law now actually requires that if you have districts that are zoned only for single family, accessory apartments have to be allowed as of right.
Can I just follow up with that? Does it have to be attached to the current home, or could it be a micro house built in the backyard or something?
My understanding is this: under the state law, it would, the recently adopted state law, it would include both attached and detached accessory apartments on the same lot.
Thank you.
But again, these zoning changes that are proposed, you wouldn't need to call a unit an accessory apartment, to be allowed to do it. It would just be allowed. So again, the final piece, just covering some of the affordable housing overlay, consistent with the policy order, the goal here is to make sure that the affordable housing overlay doesn't become more restrictive than the underlying zoning and continues to provide advantages to all affordable housing development. So although there's no text change proposed, because of the proposed change in height under the underlying zoning, the affordable housing overlay would allow, because the affordable housing overlay says if the base zoning is this, then the affordable housing overlay allows that. This change would result in 13 stories being the height limit in most of the city for the affordable housing overlay, and then it would still be up to 15 stories. That would be still be the maximum in identified areas that are identified as squares, the Harvard Central Porter, and along Cambridge Street. So the other changes that are proposed on open space, just updates to make sure that the affordable housing overlay provisions on open space remain consistent with the proposed changes out of the base zoning. Under the design standards, some design standards are proposed to be deleted because those standards would not apply under the proposed zoning to housing under the underlying base zoning. So, for instance, requirements for ground story non-residential use it would be more onerous to impose that on affordable housing developments when it's not imposed on non-affordable housing developments. So that's proposed to be deleted, and some other standards having to do with basement units and ground story elevation are deleted. A lot of that becomes superseded by the flood resilience standards that currently are in effect, that were adopted last year. And then on the design review piece, again, the procedures are made to align with the proposed changes under Article 19. The main exception is that under the affordable housing overlay, there still would never be a special permit required. It would always be as of right, whereas under the base zoning would still require a special permit at 75,000 square feet. So with that, Melissa Peters is going to talk a little bit about some of the projections that have been done.
Great, thanks, Jeff. So Jeff gave a very thorough overview of the zoning proposal. I wanted to spend the remaining presentation talking about the requested analysis that Council asked for via a policy order, looking at housing projections under alternative zoning scenarios. And specifically, that policy order looked at different versions of a proposed multifamily zoning in residential districts, as well as development capacity if we were to rezone major squares and corridors to allow for greater residential development. So just to set some context, and Jeff mentioned this in his presentation, part of the motivation for the proposed multifamily zoning petition is to increase overall housing supply, as well as the percentage of affordable units in the city. As part of Envision Cambridge, we set a goal of 12,500 net new units by 2030, of which 3,175 would be affordable. To date, since Envision Cambridge was finalized, we've built just over 3,000 units. So to give some background on the analysis we did, kind of what it is and what it isn't, this is a planning level analysis. It's not an economic analysis, and it doesn't look at specific sites and looks at site constraints of what could or could not be built. So this really shouldn't be seen as a predictive tool to identify sites and neighborhoods that where development would happen. Rather, this is useful in order to compare various policy scenarios. So as we'll present, we can be able to show how much housing would be built around these different multifamily zoning proposals to give council more information to make an informed policy decision. The analysis is split into two parts. Because the policy order asked for differences in the multifamily proposal as well as development in squares and corridors, we wanted to tease those out separately. So we do look at the residential districts of what could be built under a proposal that would affect those, and then separately looked at development capacity if we were to rezone squares and corridors. The reason these are separated is because these could be additive. So you could do, obviously, a change to the residential district in addition to a change in the squares and corridors. And to just define where we looked at the analysis, the yellow on this map is what we considered the residential districts, and the orange is the squares and corridors that we studied. And I'll talk more about these and what we modeled when we get to those slides. So a little bit more on methodology and assumptions. To be clear, when we looked at this analysis, we did not include parks and open space, hospitals, schools, any higher education parcels that are assumed to stay and not be developed. We also looked well, this is an economic analysis. We did kind of do some assumptions about when a developer would decide to develop, and particularly when it comes to inclusionary zoning, we made an assumption that if a developer could build at least 14 total units, they would opt in to the inclusionary zoning ordinance. But if they couldn't, let's say they could only build 12 or 13, it'd be more economically viable to build 9 market units and to forgo those affordable units. The one exception is there's one scenario where we looked at 6-story if they're all subject to inclusionary zoning. And for that case, because the alternative is to build to the base zoning, we thought the developers may choose to build the 10 units that would require 20% to be affordable versus the alternative to build up to 35 feet that might only warrant 3 or 4 units. We also applied a growth rate that we looked at from past housing starts. So these differ for both the residential districts and the squares and corridors. So for the residential districts, this was assumed to be 0.25% per year. and 1% in the major squares and corridors. And again, this gets to the point that this isn't looking at what's economically viable today. We all know from a recent housing committee meeting that, currently housing development is not happening in this market. But this is a way to look over the past 15, 20 years to see what's been the case and predict that similar pace moving forward. We also want to note that we don't include affordable housing development that's produced under either the Affordable Housing Overlay or the Affordable Housing, or funded by the Affordable Housing Trust in this analysis. So those would all be in addition to the numbers that we provide. And that's because those types of developments can happen both in the residential districts and in the squares and corridors, and we didn't want to overweight one more than the other.
Just on that one, only because a number of people have been writing to us. I know we said the goal by 2030 is 12,500. You've already built 3,500, so there's, I think, 7,350 to go or something. People have been asking, so I know we have several AHO-related properties being built now. Does that go towards the 7,300 that we're still trying to accomplish when we're calculating our goal of 12,500?
Yeah, that would go towards that. That is limited, as you know, to funding sources. So Chris may have a more specific number, but we've been estimating between 50, maybe up to 100 units per year that's funded through the trust.
Yeah, I think the reason some people were asking it is like, we're saying 7,300, and there's already several hundred of those in the pipeline being built. So we may even only be talking 6,500 or 7,000 at this point. So I just wanted to make that clear to the audience.
Yeah, fair point. Thank you. And when we looked at sites that were likely for redevelopment, we looked at a comparison of what's existing as built on the site compared to the potential that can be built under the various zoning scenarios. And that differed based on whether we were in a residential district or in a square or corridor. And I can talk through that more on this next slide. So essentially, we looked at, in that middle column, what's built today, and we compared that to the new capacity, and that capacity differed based on the zoning scenario that we were evaluating. And then we subtracted the as-built from the potential to get what we called a GFA delta. And in a residential district, if that GFA delta was greater than 4,000 square feet, or at least a third more development capacity, we determined that that site was likely to be redeveloped. In the corridors and squares, we had said that GFA delta would need to be at least 10,000 square feet, and it would need to be at least a doubling of development in order to be redeveloped. And we assumed, as we looked at the analysis, 1,000 square feet per unit to get our unit counts.
Council Nolan?
So I just want to understand the slide before this.
Sure.
On the top one, residential areas, so that whatever your property is, if the potential is to add a third more, then it was viewed as a possible redevelopment?
That's correct.
Maybe I'm missing something, but doesn't that apply to every single property in the entire city? Because if you're going from a height of 2 or 3 stories to 6 stories, you have doubled the potential. So can you just explain why that's not true?
I mean, I think it does
Every
apply.
single residential that currently has a single, 2 or 3 or multi-unit. Right, so they would be even more. In other words, it seems like it's a minimum of a doubling of capacity on every single residential unit. But for some, if they're only single story and it goes up to 6, it could be 5x or 6x. So I think I must be missing something.
We have
Give
a
us one
caucus
second.
going on.
We're phoning a friend.
Right? I mean, if you have a single story and you can go up to 6, that's 5X. Right, so what I'm saying is everything that is 3 stories or less would have potential because it would be doubling. Because everything can go up to 6 stories.
All
No,
right,
it's doubling, it's 100%.
Okay, all right, hold on. Let's let the staff coordinate and respond.
I mean, oh, go ahead, Aaron.
Assistant City Manager?
Through your chair, I think there's 2 things at play here. One is, the most important one is that that's an and. So it's 4,000, 33% potential and 4,000 square feet. So that's one piece. Both those conditions have to be met, and which would not be met on every single parcel. And then the second piece is that some parcels, maybe it's the same thing I'm saying in a slightly different way, that there are parcels that are already built beyond their zoning capacity, and so those would not pop in this analysis.
Council Nolan?
And where'd the 4,000 feet come from? I mean, if you have a 2-family home that's 3,000 square feet and you can now make it, and it's 3 stories, and you can make it 6 stories and double it, that's not going to be 4,000 extra, but it more than doubles the capacity. Why wouldn't that be development potential? I'm literally just trying to figure out the assumptions that led to this.
I like the pictures myself.
Through you, Chair. So also these numbers are based on our understanding, both on the staff side and on the consulting side, of when people make a decision to redevelop a site. So let's say you have a 2-family and you live there. It's not the easiest thing to say, I'm going to leave my house, I'm going to demolish this and rebuild something. Or let's say that you want to keep a building and add on. Not every site has that, not every existing building has that possibility. So there are a number of things that come into play for people to make a decision to actually either demolish and rebuild, or figure out a way. I mean, the easier scenarios are in some ways, I think, the extreme right on the top, in the residential districts, where let's say you have a large parcel and you have space to accommodate a whole new building. That might be the easier scenario, and people would, in fact, make more easily a choice to rebuild. However, if the existing building takes up more of your parcel, the possibilities are more limited. So this is and this is why we wanted to make the assumptions really clear up front. And we have, and that's why we also said that this is a planning scale analysis. So we could change these numbers, but we would be changing them for every single scenario. So the proportional shift would likely remain the same.
Council Nolan?
Right, so I understand you made these assumptions. As I look at it, anytime a property gets sold, it wouldn't matter, none of that would matter about someone there, that the potential would be to take down a building and build a 6-story building if this passes. That doesn't mean it will happen. This is a planning document, but it is allowed under the zoning. So I'm just trying to figure out why these assumptions were made, that it would have to have this big an increase, because it literally applies to every single residential site in the entire city that is 3 stories or less. It doesn't matter if it's out of compliance with zoning. If it can go up to 6 stories whenever it's sold, it means it more than doubles capacity, and it can have good potential. It doesn't mean it'll happen. I just want to understand the assumption. So that has been explained. I don't know where those assumptions came from. It would be helpful to hear from developers about when they would develop or not.
Through you, Chair. So there is certainly the more likely time when change would happen is when a parcel changed hands. That is, if we look at trends in the city of how often those transactions happen, and that is not something that we have taken a look at. We would get a sense of like how frequently something like that might happen. But also, more often than not, people are, there's two sets of people who purchase a building. It's people who want to live there, and then there might be people who want to developers. So it may be that this makes it more attractive for developers, so that when something changes hands, that they would be more likely to be in the mix of people who are vying for a property with the goal of redevelopment. And I think that that's very much accurate, because in some ways that is the purpose of creating an upzoning, is to actually have that change happen. So yes, I mean, I guess I think that is for the committee to think about, but absolutely, when something changes hands and a developer is purchasing it, there would very much be an incentive, and I would think that if the council adopts this zoning, then that would be certainly part of the intention, to see that transformation occur.
Councilor Sabrina Wheeler, I know you have I don't know if you had anything. Okay. I know Councilor Ziem is on. I think we saw his hand raised. I don't know if Councilor Ziem, do you have a question or a comment?
Sorry, I was just struggling to get promoted earlier. It's just from that.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry for the interruption, Ms. Peters.
No problem. Great questions. So wanted to talk through the 6 different residential scenarios we studied as part of this analysis. The first, of course, is what we presented previously at the Housing Committee, which is housing projections under the proposed zoning petition, so the 6-story as of right. The next 3 are scenarios that were requested by City Council per the policy order. One being the 4-story in residential A and B districts and 6 stories in residential C. The next being 6-story for inclusionary zoning projects only. So you could go up to 6 stories if you included 20% to be affordable.
And just to be clear on that one, that you wouldn't be able to do anything beyond the current zoning unless you do 6 stories.
That's right. Okay. Well, if you didn't do inclusionary, you couldn't get the 6 stories.
Okay.
Otherwise, you go back to the base zoning in whatever underlying district you're in.
Thank you.
So to that point, if you didn't have an affordable project, multifamily housing wouldn't be allowed in A and B districts. 4-story as of right, plus up to 8 stories on select neighborhood streets. This looked at what if we allowed 4 stories in all of our residential districts, but then allowed additional height, either 6 or 8 stories on certain neighborhood streets. And the streets that we were requested to model were Broadway, Prospect Street, Huron Ave, and Concord Ave. And when I get to that slide, I'll talk more about specifically what we modeled. And then 2 additional scenarios that staff identified to evaluate. And to be clear, these aren't staff proposals, but we did think this helped to round out the analysis. 4-story as of right. This was an idea that we heard a lot of in the community meetings. And so we wanted to test what housing production would be if we allowed 4-story in all residential districts. And then the last scenario is a scenario that we were studying earlier this year as part of the Housing Committee discussions, which looked at 4 stories as of right, but you can get an additional 2 stories for inclusionary zoning projects only. And then just to walk through each of this. So the first one, again, the proposed multifamily zoning petition under consideration, 6-story as of right. This would yield by 2030, 1,630 net new units, of which 310 would be affordable. And then by 2040, we'd have over 4,800 net new units.
Mr. Chair?
Wheeler?
Thanks. I had a question on this one. On this slide, do we expect the 4,880 units to be evenly distributed across all the neighborhoods, or do we think it would lead to the creation of more units in some neighborhoods than others?
So again, this is a planning level. We didn't look case by case. I would say it depends a lot on, larger parcel size might be more likely to redevelop first. Single ownership would be more likely to develop first. So it's hard to definitively say. You have to look at other parameters.
Gotcha. But the neighborhoods with more single-family housing, larger lot sizes would be likely to see much more housing under these scenarios than the other neighborhoods, or just more housing. Those would be likelier.
Yeah, I think single ownership is probably the biggest determining factor, and so looking at where those are in the city would be helpful. I
would love, and I've trying to ask for this, would love to see that analysis as an additional side. I can send an email and ask for that, but would just love to see where in the city we think this would lead to the most housing. This analysis has been great and really appreciate it, but would love to see that additional thing.
Assistant City Manager?
Through you, Chair, I would say that we don't have a way to provide something that would really get into that level of detail, simply because there are so many. I mean, it would be hard to point to parcels without doing the more granular analysis of what does the parcel shape look like? Does it have enough space for actually accommodating a building within it? And there's also parameters like, would somebody choose to redevelop? Yes, no, maybe. So it's really challenging. I think we feel comfortable doing this at this scale, but if we were to do something that was as granular as going site by site, it could be like a 6-month analysis to get us there. So I'm really reluctant to commit to us being able to provide that kind of detail.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I'm not asking for something at that level of granularity. I'm asking for the two factors that just pointed out: which neighborhoods have more single-family housing, which have larger lot sizes. I think we know that. I think we know which neighborhoods tend to have more single-family homes, which ones tend to have larger lot sizes. I'm not asking for down to the single number, which one, how many housing do we think will be in this one, that one. Just a general, where do we think this would lead to more housing? Where do we think it would not lead to as much housing?
I mean, through you, Chair, maybe I can just answer that right now, but to just state what I think everybody here is familiar with, which is that the districts that currently only permit single and two-family buildings are the ones that have more large parcels and more parcels in single ownership. So we would be looking at the A and B districts in that case, where the potential would be greatest. But that said, there's also the counter argument that because there are so few single and two-family buildings in the city, there's also a possibility that those might become more coveted and may remain. So this is why it's really hard to say, we could tell you physically that these are the districts where the potential exists, but it should not be seen as necessarily that that's where change would occur, which is why I'm hesitant.
And I would just, if I could really briefly, I would just love a slide with that. That was super helpful. Would love to see that on a slide. And, I realize we don't know all the info about it, but that's just a question I've gotten over and over again. Where do we think this is going to lead to a lot of redevelopment in the port, or is it going to be West Cambridge? And just, I realize we don't have all the info here, but just that sort of thing on a slide would be super helpful. If that's what we think, let's just say it explicitly so that we have something for folks to ask. Thanks.
Just to tag on that, I think, I'm guessing if I put the slide up right now, it's North and West Cambridge that has the most potential in terms of square footage and space. That's just my assumption. But at the same time, I'm glad that the Assistant City Manager made this comment Ms. Peters made at the beginning is, we're dealing with a situation where many people are just imagining the single-family house next door being torn down and a 6-story apartment building going up. Everything that's in this presentation is about potential. There's the potential if the zoning happens. Whether that's the probability or not is completely up in the air because, as the Assistant City Manager said, single-family homes are coveted in Cambridge. So there's always going to be a market of people who will buy that property at more than top dollar because they want a single family as opposed to a developer who buys it, wants to buy it and tear it down. So there's always going to be that struggle, and I don't know if we can make that prediction. But Council Wilson, then Vice Mayor, then Council Wilson, then Council Siddiqui, and then Council Nolan.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I think, again, I agree with you, Mr. Chair, that I think, it's very hard. We can't say exactly what is going to happen. There are too many market forces. There's all kinds of variables to determine, so a lot of this is, giving our, best sort of, I don't want to say best guess, because it's not a guess. It's not, I know some people think we're just throwing darts at a dartboard, but we're not doing that. So, the best analysis that we can. But one thing, just to sort of follow up on Councilor Sabrina Wheeler's question, is, if you say, look, someone could build, I suppose, one of those needle buildings like you see in New York, right? That a 6-story building on a tiny lot where every apartment is 10 feet deep, right? I don't think that's, that's going to happen. But if we could give people sort of an idea of, to build a 6-story building and to comply with all the different open space and setbacks and all the different things that people have to comply with, you would need a lot size of, again, it's not perfect because things can happen, but you really need a lot size of 8,000 square feet, right? I'm just, and so in my neighborhood in Riverside, the average lot size is about 2,500 to 3,000. So for someone to build a 6-story building there, they would really have to buy 2 to 3 consecutive houses and put those lots together. Where in other parts of the city, maybe it's only one parcel they have to buy, or maybe it's 2 parcels they have to buy. So, if we can help, at least gives people some sort of sense of what the likelihood is, because I do think it's different for different neighborhoods, because it's that much more complicated if you have to buy 3 or 4 houses to combine lots to build a 6-story building versus in another neighborhood where maybe you only have to buy 1 or 2. And so I don't know exactly how we get there, or what you guys are the experts, but I think you're right, Councilor Torn. I think people are sort of saying in every neighborhood these buildings are going to sprout out next to me, and it's really going to be more complicated than that. I don't think we're going to see as many of these as people are fearful we're going to see. So I don't know how you get there. That's why you guys are paid the big bucks. But I think if we can give some expectations to people as best we can, that would be helpful.
Assistant City Manager, I don't know if that's a potential response or...
Through you, Chair, I think we'll give some thought to how we can help people get a little bit more of a sense of what's possible. But honestly, it isn't as straightforward as lot size. We couldn't really say that, because if you have a small parcel with a building that's boarded up, a small parcel somebody might choose to redevelop, whereas if there's a larger parcel that has shorter building that covers a large percentage of the lot, but that there's a lot of investment that has gone into it recently, that lot may not redevelop for a very long time. So this is why it's very hard to translate, because there are so many different factors at play. I think what we could do is, it's essentially a version of the map that Jeff showed earlier when he said, here are the districts that we are proposing, in this proposal would be rezoned to C1. So those districts tend to have the larger lots, and we could certainly say that these are the districts that have the biggest rezoning, biggest change, and therefore they may be more consideration that people give to changing what exists there. However, there are these other factors of how much value exists in the building that already is there. Some of those are historic districts where it's harder to make change. But so we can sort of lay out the discussion. We are not going to be able to show on a map, like, here's where change is likely to happen, beyond just calling out the districts where the biggest rezoning is happening.
Just a quick follow-up.
Yep, Vice Mayor.
So it's not necessarily that redevelopment won't happen, but redevelopment to a 6-story building. So I'm just thinking of the Soden and Western Ave, right? That triple-decker that was in really bad shape for a long time. Lots of things happened that behind the scenes with that building, but eventually that got redeveloped. That's probably not a lot that you could build a 6-story building on necessarily. And so it did get redeveloped. It got redeveloped into 2 single-family homes that are $2.5 million apiece, which I'm not sure is a great result. But so it's not that it didn't get redeveloped. It's just it probably wouldn't have been redeveloped into what we're talking about here, because the lot size isn't big enough.
Through you, Chair. Well, I guess what I can say is let us think about this, and we'll figure out if there's some way we can talk through the thought process. It's probably not going to be a map that shows here's where change is going to happen, but we can maybe explain a couple of sites and say, here's what somebody might be thinking about in a scenario like this.
Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll actually yield my time to Councilor Siddiqui since she hasn't spoken yet.
Councillor Siddiqui.
Thank you, Chair. It was to something that you had said, and let me try to see if I have what I was trying to follow up with your point around. I think in the discussion around single-family homes, I think we've gotten some emails that people are upset about the teardowns, right? We're seeing 2-unit, units being converted to these single families. We have probably data on the teardowns that are happening, and people do seem to say, look, we don't want the single family homes, we want multifamily to stay, but the concern is obviously around the height and other pieces. But I think all to your point of there's a lot of uncertainty in this situation. I think people have said, why can't you just focus on the teardowns and doing some kind of coming up with a policy where you prevent those teardowns? I think my recollection, I think we asked about that. We can't do anything. So I just, at that moment, wanted to bring it up here as we were talking about this. I don't have much to say beyond that, but it kind of followed what you said, but then not exactly following everything, but wanted to get that point in there. Thanks.
Sure. Councillor Nolan? Did you want to? Oh, sorry.
Thank you. I'll reclaim my time now. But thank you, Chair. I just had a question in regards, so this is a really robust conversation, and I just want to appreciate it and really want to appreciate the fact that what we are speaking to is a lot of hypothetical. Like, we have no concrete information that's going to tell us this is exactly what we're going to get, this is exactly how it's going to go down and where. And I think what's really challenging, I think, for me to kind of follow it is because the market can look different, things can change, and we just don't know. And so I think what's hard is really, as we look back at Envision Cambridge and the projections, and seeing that we are pretty far off from that number that we had, it kind of leads me to believe or wonder what kind of conversation were we actually having in 2019, and we are now so far from that number. So like the conversation that we're having today, what will this look like even 5 years from now? Like, just in a reality space. Like, I appreciate the work that you all do, and then I look at this that's based on a lot of the work that you all have done to help us kind of get to this Envision Cambridge, but we're off, right? And so how do we now shift to this mindset and this thinking and then try to get back on target? So I know that's a loaded question, and I do this to you all every single time, but I can't help but not to, because there's some difficulties that impacts, I think, the communities in which we represent, and especially most vulnerable communities and those who are talking about or concerned about displacement and stuff. And then it's like, well, how are we going to actually get to the affordability? How are we going to get to these target goals when we're off, right? We're already off. We're not sure exactly what we're talking about, a lot of hypotheticals, because we don't really have concrete information. Any help that you can offer?
No, thank you, through you, Chair. It's a great point. I think, and we alluded to this earlier, this is a planning analysis and based on, this current petition. But this petition alone, as you can see with these numbers, is not going to get us to the 7,000 units we need by 2030 to meet that Envision Cambridge goal. So I think, the task is, and we'll have slides on this later about where else in the city can we increase residential capacity and change the zoning to at least allow the framework for developers to build. That's not to say that they will build in this current market, but over time. I think what we do show in our projections is that while we aren't going to meet our 2030 projections by 2030, we can meet them by 2035 and certainly surpass them by 2040. And so I think, we're a little late, but I think taking action and passing zoning, will be important.
Assistant City Manager.
Thank you, Chair, through you. I'll say two things. So one is in terms of Envision Cambridge, the target for Envision Cambridge was essentially following a thought process of what is the need in Cambridge, what is going to be the need in Cambridge given what we see of commercial development, what we know about the need for affordable housing. So it was sort of articulating need. And then it recognized that in order to get there, we actually cannot get there with the zoning at that time. And that's why we identified that we need to really take a look at different parts of the city. The bulk of the development is likely to happen in our corridors, squares, emerging districts like Kendall Square, and Alewife, and that is still true. And I think I'm getting a little ahead of Melissa here, so you'll see more on that. And our planning work that is underway that we will be bringing to you for rezoning of those areas is intended to help us get there. Now, what Envision Cambridge didn't and couldn't have anticipated is that we would have a pandemic that would essentially ice all development for easily 4 years, and then in its aftermath, things would be really slow. So that's the other piece that we are seeing right now. And then I feel like there was another thing that I was going to say. Oh, well, the other thing is that in planning, and I guess we'll take you into the ambiguity that exists in our world, in our profession, which is the only way that we can assure that something gets built is if we own something and we say, here's what we're going to do, we'll build this. But zoning, which is the realm of all of us as city planners and actually all of you as councilors who adopt that zoning, that we can only collectively set the parameters for what is possible. We can't actually force it to happen. We can create incentives for various things, and we do. And this, what we are talking about, is essentially saying that we're not going to be able to get to our target with the world as it looks right now, regulatorily. So we're going to need to make some change to create an incentive to build housing. So that is sort of why we are all here today, and I hope that helps.
Thank you. Yeah, that's helpful. And I think, obviously naming COVID is a big, reminder to all of us that really put us in a stuck pot, in a stuck place. And I understand that. And actually, I think that also then revved up the urgency and the need for these additional units, right? Because we already had housing need prior to, and it just really increased since then. And so this goes to my next question in terms of vacancies. And so we've had this conversation quite a few times now about the number of vacancies that we have across our city. And I think you all have done some analysis, got some information. This was shared at some meeting some time ago. And so maybe you're not prepared to talk about that now, but hopefully in our next meeting, maybe we can talk a little bit more about those vacancies and like how we see some of those homes kind of turning over, whether they're single family, whether they are multi. What does that kind of look like as we're continuing to look at these numbers?
If I can, and correct me if I'm wrong, Council Wilson, I think you're referring to, we've had testimony, we've had emails from people throwing numbers at us saying that there's, thousands of vacancies in the city, or, who owns what property and is just sitting on it, things like that. It would be helpful, I guess, not right now, but for you to give us what you believe are the accurate numbers, because there is a degree of discussion out in the community. There's all these empty apartments that aren't being used, and why do we need to build more apartments? Is that where you're going, Council Wilson? Is that part of it?
Yeah, that's part of it. Not necessarily though. So why would we need to build more? But more so, how are we maximizing on the vacancies to get a better sense of like what's the potential, the possibility there?
Before you go to Councilor Nolan, we are at 3:49. And I wanted to ask Ms. Peters, I don't want to rush you. I want to ask the council to vote to extend the time for the amount of time you need. So do you need another 20, 30 minutes to finish the presentation? Because this is very important. This is the part we asked you to go deep on. So
At least 20 minutes to finish the presentation, more for discussion.
Great. So if I could have a motion to extend the meeting to 4:30 for those of you who can stay that late. So moved by Council Wilson. Madam Clerk?
Counselor Azim?
Yes.
Yes. Vice Mayor McGovern?
Yes.
Yes. Counselor Nolan? Yes. Counselor Siddiqui?
Yes.
Yes. Counselor Sabrina Wheeler?
Yes.
Yes. Counselor Toner?
Yes.
Yes. Counselor Wilson? Yes. Counselor Zusi?
Yes.
Yes. Mayor Simmons? Absent. And you have 8 members recorded in the affirmative and 1 recorded as absent.
Thank you. And Council Nolan?
Thanks. Really appreciate all the work that went into this. Love all these scenarios. We're all assuming kind of this envision number, which was just a straight up 25% increase in all the housing units across the district. It is far more than the MAPC report from 2017, which was the last one I looked at. I don't know if they updated it. And by that report, Cambridge, in order to fulfill its housing requirements statewide, was nowhere near that. So it doesn't mean we can't do more, but I just want to put it all in context of be proud of what we're doing as a city compared to others, which the Greater Boston Housing Report Card, which just came out last week, showed that too. And I want us to do more, and I'm totally jazzed that we're looking at ending exclusionary zoning. And this is a call to say every other city, if they were doing what we were doing, we wouldn't be in as much trouble or for the Greater Boston area. And it's important for us to remember all that. I do hope that we'll get the algorithm that led to these numbers. I mean, that somewhere there was some algorithm, it was like 0.25% here and 1% here. That would be really helpful to know. And because somewhere, some formula ended up with 4,880, 920. So I think if we could all see the algorithms for all these scenarios, that would be really helpful.
So what I'm going to ask my fellow councilors, myself included, short of yes, no, clarifying questions between now and then 4:30, let you finish the presentation, and if we have time, a few more questions. But I really want to land.
We don't have to answer that question.
Yeah, no, I know.
Yeah.
I want to land the plane today because on December 4th, we'll be opening up the public comment, and I hope each and every one of us and everybody watching in 2 days when the link goes up sends this video out to everybody in the city of Cambridge so that there's an informed conversation based on this. So, Ms. Peters, sorry, and take it away.
Can I just say one more, which is
Council Nolan.
It's, as Councilor Sabrina Wheeler asked about the neighborhood, this is a perfect example for those of us who are just in Tampa and LC. AI is a perfect use for this. It should not take 6 months to take our entire database of parcels across the city and answer some of these questions. And we have really whip-smart people working for the city and also whip-smart people in the community who could probably do this in just a couple days with to get us a rough analysis of exactly those kinds of questions we're all asking. So I would encourage us to consider that, get that done, and we would have a really robust conversation around some of these questions because it's really important for us all to be able to answer those questions. Where are those, particularly where are those units going to get built? Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. So the second scenario is the 4-story as of right in residential A and B and 6 stories in residential C. And this would yield just over 1,200 net new units by 2030 and over 3,600 by 2040. Six-story for inclusionary projects only. Again, the base zoning in the underlying district would apply unless the project includes 20% of the units as affordable. So in this scenario, we'd get about over 1,500 new units by 2030, about 20% would be affordable, and then by 2040, we'd have over 4,600 net new units.
Ms. Peters, sorry, Councilor Ziem has his hand raised. Councilor Ziem, did you have a question?
Oh, yes, I had a question about this slide whenever
Sure.
Ms. Peters is done with it.
Go ahead if you want to ask the question.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you would be able to tell us a little bit more about the underlying assumptions for like this specifically the last line on base zoning and how you think about this approach.
Yeah, so in terms of the assumptions, this is the one exception to that assumption we used where developers would need to build at least 14 units to cross-subsidize the affordable units when they have other alternatives. In this case, because the alternative is the base zoning, it's significantly less than what this proposed zoning would allow. We thought that to be conservative, that they would build if they at 10 units and did 2 units affordable, that would be more advantageous than just building either a single family in Res A or up to 35 feet in Res B. The thing to note is that this would not allow multifamily in Res A and B districts, except if those buildings include inclusionary units. So that I think is an important policy distinction for council to consider.
Councilor Ziem?
Thank you. I guess I just had like 1 or 2 follow-up questions. One, in general, is I understand that some of my colleagues favor this option, and I think it's I see the appeal of it, and I'm certainly not I think that it's actually somewhat reasonable, but I do have a few concerns. One is as you were just saying about the exclusionary piece about not changing district lines for Res A and B and having multifamily housing citywide is one. The second is that if I'm understanding this correctly, you could under this, you'd probably not be able to add an ADU or extend a bedroom or add an extra unit because those would have to be affordable. And given that 90% of residential roughly is non-conforming, but you would be able to build a 6-story building next door. Is that right? Yeah,
that's a great point. So that additional relief and capacity would not be available to, say, a 2-family home who wanted to build an ADU because that would need to be affordable in order for that to apply.
Can I just sorry, Councilor Ziem, can I put a pin in that? Because I think that's another thing a lot of people at home in the audience don't realize. I think they think the zoning is strictly geared towards building 6-story buildings, but this zoning, if it passes, would actually also provide relief to people who simply want to stay in their home, but put on an ADU or dormers or whatever because their home has just gotten too small. So there's a twofold purpose to this. Is one, making it easier for people to make changes to their homes, but 2, if you want to do something bigger and bolder in terms of multifamily housing. So I'll stop there. And Councilor Ziem, did you have another question or a follow-up?
I was just going to say exactly your point, Councilor Toner, which is I think that, we can, if it's the will of the council, go with some version of 3. But it does, I think, eliminate that second piece where you could build a rather large apartment building, and it would probably be large because every inclusionary building that's been built in the city is at least 6 stories. But you would not be able to make those small modifications to your house. And so it's a little bit of a weird balance, but I certainly understand the appeal of this version as well. And just to one last piece is that I was just wondering, like, we have this different, I'm always a little bit worried about whether 20% IZ, like how well it pencils. I was wondering, have we seen any 10-unit, 11-unit affordable buildings? Because I know you were saying that normally it's 14 units is the assumption at which it becomes economical, but here you lowered that assumption to like 10. And I was just wondering, do we have any? I know like Somerville kind of has a version of this already where they have districts that are 6 stories, but you have to build inclusionary regardless of the size. I don't know if that might not be a number you have today, but I just thought I'd ask if you do.
Ms. Peters, or I see Mr. Carter also trying to get your attention.
Which way are you going?
So through you, Chair Toner, no, we have not seen 10-unit developments in quite some time with inclusionary, but I think the thing to note here would be under this scenario, the 10-unit development with inclusionary would essentially be accessing additional market units that would be available beyond the current bonus. So it's not really an apples-to-apples comparison as to what we would expect to see today in a 10-unit development where a 10-unit development, even with inclusionary, would not be possible in the A or the B district.
Councilor Zine? Our Assistant City Manager. Sorry, Councilor Zine.
I just wanted to add one thing. So one is, as we look at these are some of the speculative things in an analysis like this, that one piece is that we are thinking of people making decisions based on what they could do under base and what they could do under the inclusionary scenario in this particular example. But there is also just a basic market analysis piece, which is if somebody cannot make a 10-unit building with 2 affordable units pencil out, then no matter how different it is from what's allowed in the base, it's possible that they are not going to be able to build it. So you should think of this particular scenario and the numbers here as kind of a conservative estimate of the maximum that's possible, simply because we don't have a scenario in the city, so we don't have experience to rely on in the same way as we can speak about some of the other scenarios. So it is a little bit of it may be a little bit of an overcount, but it will certainly be more than some of the other scenarios that we'll get to later that are just shorter buildings. So again, I would say people shouldn't take this as a prediction of the future, but more as just a conservative estimate for this scenario.
Councilor Zine, do you yield?
I just have a few last words and then I'll yield.
Okay, go ahead.
And these are my only questions for the presentation today. But I just wanted to leave off by saying, like, I think that this is, I certainly see the appeal, and I'm not, totally opposed to this approach either. But I do think it's a little bit high risk, high reward, in that both you have to imagine that 20% inclusionary pencils out throughout the city. And right now, not even pure market rate housing pencils out. And the second is that it will create an environment where, under other approaches, you might see, a neighbor build a 3-story building and then a 4, and then there's some 5, and then there's some 6. Under this approach, you would only see 6-story buildings. And so it is a little bit of a, like you get no change at all for most of the city. And then when you do see change, it's a really big change. And so, I think it's a, very interesting approach. But again, if this is, I don't think we're going to vote on anything tonight. But like when we have those discussions, if this is where majority of people lies, I'm, open to it. So thank you.
We will not be voting on anything tonight. Councilor Zusi and then the Vice Mayor.
So I wonder, why is it an either or, not an and? Why couldn't we have the 6-story for inclusionary projects only and encourage multifamily housing citywide and allow for a relaxation to the creation of AUDs, or ADUs, right? Auxiliary dwelling units.
Yeah, thank
you.
Next slide.
Maybe not the next slide, but maybe in 4 slides, we will get to that scenario.
Councilor Zusi, was that okay? My Vice Mayor McGovern.
So, thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. So in this scenario, So if you live in Res A, where multifamily housing is not allowed, but there is some still there because most of our housing is non-conforming. So if I own a triple decker in Res A and somebody buys it and knocks it down, wants to knock it down, but maybe it's on a lot that can't fit a six-story building, or maybe because of the inclusionary component, I don't want to do a six-story building. I'm going to knock down a triple-decker, which is 3 units, but the only thing I would be allowed to rebuild in that area is a single-family zoning. And I think that's one of the things we're trying to avoid, right? We're trying to avoid losing units for single-family housing. So this would not address that concern, correct?
Through you, Chair, that is correct. And just to Councillor Zusi's question, I did want to say this scenario looks the way it does because this was one that the council specifically asked us to analyze through the policy order. There could be multiple variations where you could say you rezone A and B to C1 also and no further, but don't go up to 6, or you could say you could say the scenario that Melissa is talking about. So there's multiple things that could happen in between.
So just to get back to sort of my train of thought. So because we've heard folks raise concerns that they're afraid of tear downs in parts of the city that where multifamily housing is already allowed, right, in some of the more dense parts of the city, like on this side of town. So in this scenario, I could imagine that you would actually see more tear downs in this side of the city, because if you could tear down a triple decker and you're allowed to replace that with multifamily housing up to 6 stories, that might be advantageous. Where if I'm in a part of the city where multifamily housing is not allowed, what might be the best financial scenario for me is to build a single-family home and sell it for $3 million. I can anticipate that we might see more tear downs in parts of the city where some people are concerned that they don't want to see those tear downs, because those are already sort of more economical parts of the city. Does that make any sense, or am I just been sitting there too long?
Yeah, through you, Chair. I think that logic follows. I think this was Councillor Zeem's point, is that in a good market, you'll see a lot of activity up to that amount. So that could entail tear downs. But in a bad market, you might not see anything for a long time. So a more variable zoning proposal would be able to provide more variation in the housing supply, as well as different amounts of production throughout different cycles. But I think it's hard. I think it's hard to say.
Yeah, no. I mean, all of this is hard to say. But I think we also keep talking about 6 stories as if that it's up to 6 stories too, right? So in this scenario, again, if we were to choose this scenario and someone were to knock down a triple decker in Res A, or a 2-family in Res A, they could either go to 6, but it would preclude them from building a 4-story building.
Well, they could build a 4, but it would have to have 20% inclusionary. So
which we're hearing is not economical to do.
Be viable. So yes, they would only build 6, most likely.
That's concerning. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Now we'll get back to the
back
only
to me?
clarifying questions,
Okay.
yes or no.
So on to.
Oh, and I'm sorry. I just want to acknowledge that Mayor Simmons is here.
So the 4th scenario we looked at per the policy order was 4-story as of right in all residential districts, and then either 6 stories or 8 stories on select neighborhood streets. And we modeled 6 stories on Huron Ave and 8 stories on Concord, Prospect, and Broadway. And this yielded 990 net new units by 2030, of which 140 would be affordable. And by 2040, just under 3,000 new units in these residential districts. I did want to note that we included these neighborhood streets in these residential districts and not in the forthcoming corridor and squares analysis, because we didn't want to double count units, because these are, if they're not here, they're in the underlying residential base zoning. The fifth scenario is one, again, that was identified by staff, and one we were hearing from the community as, what if we allowed 4-story as of right? And this generates the least amount of housing of all the scenarios. It's 900 units by 2030, of which 120 are affordable, and up to 2,700 by 2040. And then the last scenario, to Councilor Zusi's question, is the 4-story as of right, but you can get those additional 2-story bonus for inclusionary projects only. This again was discussed at the Housing Committee that staff had previously presented, and so we wanted to run the numbers on this as well to give a full analysis. And in this scenario, we get just shy of 1,500 net new units by 2030, of which 310 are affordable, and then just under 4,500 net new units by 2040.
Chair, just
Council Nolan?
yeah, one quick comment on this, which may not be able to answer, but it would be really good again to have the algorithms that led to this, because what I cannot understand is how scenario 6 would lead to fewer units than scenario 3, because scenario 3 is inclusionary units in all 6 stories as of right. This includes all of that, and in addition, 4 stories as of right across the entire city. It should be additive, and I could not understand how it is that it would ever lead to less. So it'd just be, again, I'm putting out there that that's a question I hope to have the answer to when we understand the underlying assumptions and algorithm.
Any response?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question, and the reason that you could see that scenario 3 generated more units than scenario 6 is because of that assumption we made of when projects would move forward, and because the alternative under scenario 3 is the base zoning, there's more an incentive to go up to 6 and do the inclusionary than it is in scenario 6, where there's more projects that would avoid inclusionary zoning and build at 4. And so based on that assumption, this was the difference in total units. As you can see, they're very comparable in terms of total units and affordable units produced. So I think in terms of all the different considerations, they're two good policy proposals. But so this slide tries to compare them all together. The scenario, the 6-story as of right, the current petition is the one that yields the highest number of housing units by 2030 and 2040. Here's the 2030 numbers. And then the lowest is the 4-story as of right. And then again, we have a range in the different scenarios, as you can see. Of importance, we included the percent of affordable units in parentheses. And so you can see that they all vary between 13 and 20% of the total units that are affordable. And so, in addition to the envisioned goal of adding more total housing, there is a goal to obviously increase our affordable housing stock and to increase that percentage so that we have a diverse community. So I think that's an important policy consideration as well. And here's the figures for 2040 with the additional 10 years estimated. Same relationships. And the only thing I'll call out on this slide in particular is that the range that these proposals yield is between 2,700 to 4,800, and both of which are significantly higher than what would be produced under the current zoning, which is 300 units by 2040. Okay, moving to squares and corridors. So the policy order asked us to look at, in addition to variations in the multifamily zoning petition, how much development are we expecting in our squares and corridors, and in particularly if we were to increase residential capacity in specific squares and corridors. And so for this analysis, we assumed that we would look at rezoning the Alewife Triangle and Shopping Center and Central Square up to 18 stories, Porter Square and Inman Square to 15 stories, Mass Ave and Cambridge Street to 8 stories, and Harvard Square at 10 stories. And we included in the projections development in Kendall, the Alewife Quad, and Cambridge Crossing, but those are at the current zoning, not rezoning, because they've recently been rezoned or planned.
Ms. Peters, you said on Mass Ave 8 stories, but on the graph it says 10. So did you mean 10?
I'm sorry, I meant 10.
Okay. And just to the audience, there is nothing, this is just, you needed numbers to be able to do some calculation. So there's nothing solid about these heights. So.
Nope, they're just numbers to run the analysis. And I would say they're roughly consistent with ongoing planning discussions. For instance, in Central Square, which is proposing 18 stories, we obviously are looking forward to a forthcoming planning process in the Alewife Triangle and Shopping Center. We don't know what that will yield, but this gives us a basis for understanding potential development and capacity if we were to rezone.
Councilor Wilson?
Sorry, thank you. I just wanted to name and just be on record stating that while Central Square has a proposal or conversations around 18 stories, it sounds like that's not what the community wants. So I just want to name that that's something that is not of interest to many in the community around 18 stories. But I am curious about Harvard Square and why we would only be looking at 10 stories and maybe not 18 stories over in Harvard Square.
Again, these came from the policy order, and we're happy, this is just to give us a comparison of how much can be produced in squares and corridors compared to the residential districts. And certainly, all of these should have separate planning discussions with the community to really understand the nuances. But this is a way to, again, in all these cases, to understand the scale of change. And so these could be, if this yields the number that the council wants to see achieved in a certain time period, we can kind of look at this as a blueprint to kind of guide our decision making as we plan for future areas, but certainly not set in stone. A lot of additional engagement would need to be done. Okay. Modeling those specific heights in those areas, by 2030, the squares and corridors would yield just shy of 5,000 net new units by 2030, of which 830 would be affordable. And by 2040, 12,425 new units, of which just under 2,000 would be affordable. And I did note here the comparison to what would be produced under current zoning if we didn't change. So by 2030, that would be 3,600 approximately units, and by 2040, just over 8,500 units. So this slide here tries to kind of compare them together, and again, these would be additive. So you could do something in the residential district and also do things in the squares and corridors, and you would add those together to get total units by a certain date. I selected here the 6-story as of right and the 4-story as of right as the two scenarios that were at the high and low extremes, so you can kind of see the difference. So in any of these residential scenarios, you can get between 900 to 1630 new units by 2030. And you compare that to development in the squares and corridors, you can get up to 5,000 units. So in any case, even under current zoning, the squares and corridors are going to continue to be the area of the city that will be redeveloping the greatest. And here's the figures for 2040. And then in summary, by 2030, the city will fall short of its envision Cambridge housing target under both the current and proposed zoning. So under current zoning, we'll get 6,750 units by 2030, of which a small portion of that is in the residential districts, about 70. And under the proposed rezoning, we get just over 9,500 units, significantly more in the residential districts, as well as more in the squares and corridors. And then by 2040, the city would exceed its 2030 target by 2040 under current zoning. So we will get, I'm sorry, we'd still be short of our 2030 target by 2040. We'd be just under 12,000 units, but by rezoning both the squares and corridors and the residential districts, we'd exceed our 2030 target by almost 8,000 units. And we expect that we'd actually meet that target around 2035. It is important to note that we, as a city, haven't set a 2040 target, so we'd want to obviously do that as well as we get closer to 2030. So my last slide. So under current zoning, residential districts are estimated to produce approximately 70 net new units. If we were to allow a version of multifamily zoning, we could gain between 900 to 1,630 new housing units by 2030. So a significant increase in any policy scenario. For the squares and corridors under current zoning, we're estimated to produce 3,600 new housing units. And if we were to rezone those as modeled per this analysis, we can get up to 4,900 units by 2030. And then just a final comment that while these current petitions are only addressing residential districts, if we were to your point, Councilor Wilson, to get to that housing target, we'd have to rezone the squares and corridors as well. And I think we had a couple slides more on process. I don't know, Jeff wanted to speak to them, but I can quickly get back to them. But we obviously are here at our first ordinance committee hearing. We had 2 community meetings in October, and over the next 2.5 months, we'll be having a committee and planning board. There's a planning board meeting tonight on this subject.
Yeah, I'll just jump in quickly. So the update is that the planning board opened its public hearing last week on this petition. They continued that. They took public comment and heard from us. And tonight they're going to start with discussion and deliberation. We're not sure if we'll get to the end of the process tonight. If they do, then they'll have a report for the city council. But I think that's the main thing. I think the chair already noted the timeline for adoption. If it's not refiled, we did a little, because we often get asked about this, just did a little diagram to kind of explain how the process works, where the city council will get a report from the planning board and from the ordinance committee. And the city council has 90 days from this ordinance committee hearing to take action, or if they want to consider to refile. So we can answer any questions about process, but otherwise I'll just leave it there.
Mr. Chair, on the process timeline, can we just update this to include the ordinance committee meetings as well, which are public meetings? Because if you just looked at this, the ordinance, today's meeting's not on here, and we're having 2 meetings in December. We're talking about 2 or a couple in January. So if someone were to just look at this slide, they'd be missing several meetings that are part of the process. So if we could update that, that would be great.
If you can just add December 4, December 19, January 16, and we're still trying to pick January 8, 9, or 10, depending on when people are available.
Right. So in future versions, we'll do that. But we're right where we are is where the arrow is, and sort of indicating that hearings can continue throughout that process up till the red star of the deadline for action on this cycle.
And just before I go to Councilor Zusi, just again to members of the public, because we've gotten lots of people writing to us at every single meeting thinking we're taking a vote at that meeting. and we're not, there's going to be at least another 3 or 4 meetings where there'll be more public comment, more discussion, more questions and answers. And as Mr. Roberts' graph shows, because of the February holiday, we will have to make a decision on February 10th about whether we're going to move it forward, reject it, or punt and refile at a later date. But we have until that time. So I just want people to understand that we're not making any hard decisions immediately. And with that, I will go to Councilor Zusi.
Thank you so much. I want to thank all of you for all of the work that you have done for us and prepared in a very clear way, though I think I, at least, and I'm sure I'm not alone, might love to meet with you again to understand some of the fine points better. I wish, not that you want more work, but I wish you also, I mean, this wasn't part of the policy order, but I wish you also had included projections for how many units we might create in transitional zones, because in Envision Cambridge, they talked about transitional zones as another obvious place for growth to occur. And in my own neighborhood, Cambridgeport, there are 2 identified, which are such obvious places for development. The area around Albany, Brookline Street, a lot of it's MIT-owned land, but that could definitely go up to 5 stories. In the area along Memorial Drive, where the Memorial Trader Joe's is, Micro Center, that could definitely go up high with housing. And I know it's not just Cambridgeport. There are transitional zones throughout the city. So what I also would really love to understand is the potential for growth in those sites, because before we sacrifice our neighborhoods and our corridors and squares, I guess I'd love to see the numbers for projections for how many units we might get out of transitional zones by 2030 and 2040, because I think it would give us a better sense for what we need to do. And I will tell you, most of us are back from the National League of Cities Conference, and I think most of us I think we're all convinced, we all realize that we need to build more housing and affordable housing. So I think we're unified in that. The question is how to do it in a way that is in keeping with our city and less destructive to our city. And I do want to point out that even, and I'm not going to get the numbers right here, but in producing all of these units, we're still talking about lots of teardowns by 2030, which is only 6 years away, and by 2040. So it does come at a price. I mean, I realize there will be some price to increase housing, but because I love this city, and because we all love this city, I want us to be really thoughtful about it. So if there's any way you could do some extra credit work and look at the transitional zones, I would heartily appreciate it, because I think it's part of the story, and it's part of what we need to consider as we make major decisions about zoning going forward. Thank you.
ACM Farouk.
Through you, Chair, I think one of the things that would be helpful, I mean, we can analyze additional scenarios, but we need to understand what the council is proposing, or it would be helpful for us to know what are the things that the council wants us to look at as a body, and it would need to be fairly specific. We can look at the transitional zones, but we would want to know what the vision is for how tall you're going there, or what would the council like us to analyze.
Councilor Zusi.
I would need to talk to my colleagues to come up, and maybe there needs to be maybe it'll be my first policy order Monday night. But I just know, I thought the transitional zones that were mentioned in Envision Cambridge like they made so much sense to me. They were obvious places for further development. So why don't I talk to my colleagues and work on a policy order? Thank you.
Thank you. Vice Mayor McGovern?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Question and a comment. So I think we've heard, some folks really like this idea, some folks don't, but almost unanimously we've heard folks say that they do support ending, that we should allow multifamily housing to be built throughout the city. But my question is, it's not, tell me if I'm wrong, that it's not so simple as saying multifamily housing is now allowed throughout the city. If we don't change things like height and lot sizes and setbacks and all these other things that allow it to happen, we're not going to see multifamily housing developed in areas where it's not allowed already. So is that fair to say? Because I think people are saying, can't you just allow it across the city and not do all these other changes? But that wouldn't, my guess is that wouldn't yield the actual construction of any multifamily housing in those neighborhoods.
Chair, that is accurate.
That's accurate. Okay. And I just want to caution us, we're going to be entering into, the next meeting is going to be public comment, and I'm putting this out just for us as a body, but as the public, I really want to watch some of the language we use. When we say things like destructive and sacrifice when we're talking about building more housing, there's a lot of people in this city that don't think building more housing for people is going to be destructive to our neighborhoods or a sacrifice for our neighborhoods. Those are really loaded words. I just think we need to be really careful how we talk about this to not throw more fuel on this fire. We're talking about building housing for people. We're not talking about nuclear power plants or something else. We're talking about housing. And there's a lot of people in the city who don't feel that that's destructive or a sacrifice. Thank you.
Councilor Ziem, and we have just 1 minute. So Councilor Ziem, you had a comment or a question?
I just have a very quick question. For changes, potential amendments, I'm sure we'll have, but also like versions 2 through 6. I know that the expiration of this is currently February 10th. I think February 17th technically, but that's President's Day, so February 10th. I was just wondering how long before that do you need us to decide on a version so you guys have time to write the amendments?
Through you, Chair, if there is any significant rethinking or conceptual changes that need to be made, then I think we would really love to get that information in December, because staff will be, some folks will have different vacation times, and in order to meet a January deadline, we'd want to get started as soon as possible on making the changes.
Councilor Ziem?
That was my only question. Thank you.
Okay. Councilor Nolan just reminded me, Assistant City Manager, you did mention to me before the meeting, the FAQ that you've been working on, it wasn't ready for today, but it will be ready before the December 4th public comment meeting that we'll be able to publish and get out there. So if you just want to give me an update on that.
Sure. Chair, thank you. We are targeting getting it done by the end of next week, so hopefully before Thanksgiving.
Thank you very much. Vice Mayor? I just wanted to make one final comment, if we can do it without extending, is just on December 4th and potentially into December 19th, we'll be having public comment. I know that I cannot, and I would never try to tell people what they can and can't say in public comment, but we have been trying to answer people's questions that have come along so far, and I think a lot of questions that were asked have been answered in the economic development and in this meeting. So I realize people still will have more questions, more concerns, more issues, but I hope that everybody will share the 2 meetings we've had so that we can move beyond asking the same questions and focus in on these potential scenarios and their impact, and hear your thoughts and opinions about these ideas and scenarios that have been put forward, so we can, ultimately we may do nothing, we may do something, or we may take more time to refile and before we move forward. So that's the state of play at this particular point, and I will ask for a motion to adjourn from council. Excuse me, correct me, sorry. Recess, because we are keeping this meeting open to be able to have that public comment from Councilor Siddiqui. Madam Clerk?
Councilor Azim?
Yes.
Yes. Vice Mayor McGovern?
Yes.
Yes. Councilor Nolan? Yes. Councilor Siddiqui?
Yes.
Yes. Councilor Sabrina Wheeler?
Yes.
Yes. Councilor Toner?
Yes.
Yes. Councilor Wilson? Yes. Councilor Zusi?
Yes.
Yes. Mayor Simmons? Absent. And you have 8 members recorded in the affirmative with 1 recorded as absent.
Thank you, and thank you to the staff for all of your hard work. I'm sorry I didn't say that earlier.